Good afternoon, everybody. We are here to talk about capitalization in pension funds, and that's because we are just changing our retirement process in Brazil. We are trying to do a reform, and within this package of reform, people are already talking about capitalization. This is a matter that we never talked in Brazil before, and we decided to bring some great specialists in capitalization around the world so we can have a glimpse of what is going on and how are the success and the errors that was done in the past. So just as a matter of introduction, in my left is Uwe Schillhorn. Uwe is the Latin American Chief Investment Officer for Principal International. In the other side, Maree Pallisco. Maree is a partner of EI's Financial Services Office and EI's National Superannuation Leader. In the center, Mr. Lance Schoening. Lance is the Director of Federal Government Relations in the Retirement and Income Service Division of Principal USA. As a matter of beginning, let me share you some figures I just got from my colleagues at ANBIMA from a nationwide poll that was done last November, so it's quite fresh. 50% of all Brazilians don't save any money. 56% of the Brazilians rely on the public pension for their retirement. Only 6% have a private retirement plan. 50% thinks that they will retire between 50 and 60 years old. 90%, 90, of the people that are retired live on the public system pension. And interesting enough, 49% of Brazilians thinks that they will see better life after retirement. So I don't know how to cope this, but people at least seem that they will. So I will ask, please, Uwe to start his presentation, and we'll be open to the floor just after the three presents their cases. Uwe will be talking about Chilean pension schemes, and I hope that you have a lot to share with us.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks for ANBIMA for inviting me here. Let's talk about the Chilean pension system. The presentation has 4 parts to it. Basically an overview of what the Chilean pension system is, what you can do when you retire, a short diagnostic, and then lessons learned. Before I get into what the actual system is, let's look at how did we got where we are now. In 1981, Chile already changed its pension system to more or less to what they have today, to the individual capitalization system. And I think that makes it really relevant because it's the oldest system in Latin America, and you now can see already how well does the system work because people are already retiring in that system. And then he did a series of reforms, but all of these reforms, the initial 4 or 5, had to do with what you can invest in. It started with local fixed income, then they added local equity, then international fixed income, international equity. And then in 2002, they did something that was pretty significant. They got away from just one pension fund to 5 different target risk funds that they have today. Going to talk about that in more detail. In 2004, they did another reform, and basically when people retire, they had to make certain decisions, and it was up to them to make the decisions. There was no one that was providing independent advice, and they established a platform to give that advice. And then in 2008, the last reform was basically a strengthening of the solidarity pillar. It's now look at what does a system look like. It's a three-pillar system. You have a solidary pillar. It's a pay-as-you-go system, as you know it from Brazil. Then you have a mandatory individual contribution pillar, and you have a voluntary contribution pillar also. Let's start with the solidary pillar, pay-as-you-go. And it's basically available for the poorest 60% of the population. And that's already, to me, it's a strange expression, the poorest 60%, because it's more than half of the population. And it's because the incomes are very divided in Chile. It's very similar to Brazil, right? So the majority of the population is actually poor and need help from the solidary part. And it basically has two parts of the solidary part. One is a minimum pension. Even if you never contributed, you get $150 a month, more or less. And then there is a subsidy. So if you contributed but didn't really contribute enough, this can go up to a pension of $500. So $430 is roughly minimum wage. So this gets you roughly to a minimum wage. And then you have some other things like child bonus, young workers subsidy, some other technical things. But this solidary part is financed via taxes, right? And here you can see it. If you don't, these are the amounts are in Chilean pesos, but if you have zero, then you get roughly $150, and then the subsidy declines as you go towards that minimum wage of roughly, it's here, $500. So that's the solidary pillar that's still in place. Let's now talk about the mandatory pillar that you're probably much more interested in. So we have actually 6 private pension companies that manage this mandatory pillar. And they're not banks, they're not brokers, they're individual, separate companies. Now, most of them are owned by international financial institutions, but they are completely separate with a separate board. There's very limited exchange of information between these entities, so they're truly, truly separate. And the contribution to this is mandatory for every person that works, and it's voluntary for self-employed. How much do we contribute? 10% of our salary, up to a salary cap of roughly $3,200. So the most you contribute in a month is $320, basically, to this scheme. Then you as an individual basically have to choose the plan. It's not the employer, or these plans are not like for all the doctors and all the industrial workers or so. It's really for everyone is in it for himself. He has to choose the plan, and you can switch from one individual pension plan to another without any difficulties. And the fees, these different pension providers have different fees, but within the fee, within the plan, the fee is all the same. So pension plan A or pension provider A has the same fee for each target risk fund that you choose. There are 5 target risk funds you can choose, and they distinguish themselves mainly in the part that you can invest in equity. And currently, all of these funds are pretty much at the equity limit. So in Fund A, you have actually 80% in equity. That's probably pretty unusual for Brazilians that have everything in fixed income, right? So many young people are in Fund A. And if you don't choose, when you start working, it's as default. You go into the cheapest fund and you go into Fund A. So younger workers go automatically into Fund A. But you can choose. If you want to be in Fund C or B, it's up to you to choose. So that's basically the mandatory pillar. Then we have a voluntary contributive pillar too. I'm not going to talk about that much. You can basically contribute more if you want. And if you really max this out, you can save roughly $22,000 a year in taxes. Now, not many people do that because not many people have that much money, and this voluntary part is actually fairly small. The average account size of the voluntary part is only roughly $600. So, that didn't really fly. Despite the fact that the tax benefits are huge, people are not really using it. But it would be for the wealthy anyway, and it's not important right now. Then what can you do when you retire? Well, you get your old age retirement, early retirement, disability, or survivorship retirement. Let's talk about the old age retirement. What do you do when you retire with your mandatory savings? You can have a lot of choices. You basically can keep your fund and withdraw every month a little bit, and it's calculated by the pension fund how much you can withdraw. Or you can switch to an annuity. Then your pension fund will basically contract an insurance company, and they convert your pensions into an annuity. And what people are doing is roughly half stays with their individual account and withdraw a little bit each month, and half goes to the annuity pillar. And then you can do something in between. There are some other options you can do, but the main parts are these two. Okay. Then there's early retirement. That's not really important. It's for the people that have enough money. Then a good part of the system is also you have disability insurance. So if you during your worker's life get disabled, or if you die and someone has to provide for your spouse and kids, there's an insurance, and basically the employer pays for that insurance. So the 10% for your old age pension you pay yourself, but then it's roughly 2.5% or no 1.9% roughly of your wages. The employer pays to pay for this insurance. So if something happens to you, you continue to make contributions to this. And if the voluntary savings, they can be withdrawn earlier and you pay a tax penalty. That's not important either. Let's not go to the diagnostic and challenges. And this is a slide from the pension regulator with all the diagnostics part, and it's written in Spanish. But they're all bad things, they're all problems, right? So the regulator itself sees this. There's a problem here. We have a problem. So why do we have a problem in a system that's so fantastic? And there's the Melbourne Mercer Global Pension Index. They investigated all different 37 or 38 OECD pension plans here, and what they do, and let me stand up, is the pointer doesn't really work, but up there, overall Chile index looks pretty good, right? Compared to all different other pension plans, it's pretty good. And then they have different sub-indices, and Chile looks also very good. Like the plan is very well regulated, it's sustainable, it's a great plan. But the second bar chart, you can see that Chile doesn't rank so high. And is the pension adequate? No, it's not. The pensions are too low. And that's the main problem in Chile. The pensions are too low. And so there are some recommendations that Mercer gives, and I will talk about these recommendations later. So the pensions are too low. So how low are they? Well, in that table there you can see, and that's from a few years ago, roughly the pensions that people get is roughly 48% of their wages, of their last 10-year wages. But now it's actually way lower. Now it's only 30-something%. And that's in a system that had fantastic returns, almost 9% real returns over time, right? That's very high. But when you then look at this chart, you can see that the returns in the 80s were 12%, then it went down to 10% in the 90s, then into 2006%, and if we include the period in the last 10 years, it's only 3-point-some%. So in the future, the pensions will even be a lot lower than this. Go to the next slide here. So what are the challenges? The replacement is too low, and then you have a lot of different technical issues that have been identified here. lack of persistence of contribution. There's a large informal labor market. In Chile, same thing as you have here in Brazil, right? People in the informal market don't contribute. Low contribution rate, only 10%. Outdated parameters. When I showed you the pension reforms, they never had a pension reform where they shifted the retirement age or so. So, it has been the same for a long time. Independent workers are not covered. It's only mandatory for the dependent employees. Frequent switch between the pension funds. That means that the pension funds have to invest in liquid assets. They can't really invest that much in alternative assets that generally provide a higher return. Low government spending. And the last part is especially very worrying. The population is rejecting the pension system. And that is due to a lack of understanding. And that's very interesting in myself. I'm not from Chile. I've been living there for 3.5 years. But it's very hard to understand when you read about the system and it's so fantastic. So why do people don't like it, right? And here I have some charts, low replacement rates. Chile, only 33%. So on average now, the Chilenos only get 33% of their last 10-year wages in pensions. It's at the lower scale in all these OECD countries, so very small. Low density of contributions. What does that mean? Well, here you can see the members. The blue line is the members in the pension funds that at one point signed up, they worked, they contributed, but who's actually contributing is only a little bit more than half of the people, very, very few. And here you can see the average contribution is only 53%. So 6 months during the year you contribute. Women contribute a lot less than men. There's a huge gender gap here because women often don't work or work at home. They do work, but they don't get an official salary. Then, if you work, if you have a job, good job, 86% contribute. The independent ones, they can contribute, but no one does. Look at this, 6% only. Huge informal economy, lots of people work for themselves, don't contribute. Then 10% plus a little bit for the disability insurance. The contributions are way too low. In OECD average, it's 18%. Chile is at 12-13%. Life expectancy. It was 70 years for men when Chile started the system. It's 77 years now. It's a huge difference. So this was meant to cover 5 years, and now it needs to cover 12 and a half. And they never changed the retirement age. Then we go to public spending. Chile spends very little. The government spends very little, 3.9%. Other OECD governments spend a lot more on pension. My understanding is that it's 12% in Brazil right now. So there's a huge gap here. So people don't like the system. And a high percentage of the population believe that only a complete change in the AFP system will help improve pensions, and believe that the AFPs, those are the pension administrator, those are the private companies, they are responsible for the low pensions. Whereas technically, this system was set up by law, and the private companies are only managing the money, and they had good returns, they have low fees, there are statistics, but the population doesn't buy it. And in 2016-17, there were more than 2 million people on the streets protesting against the pension system. There's a movement, it's called No Mas AFP, No More AFP. And the anger about the low pensions is directed against the private companies that administered the plan but didn't set the plan up. And the private pension companies didn't do anything for many years. They didn't really educate the public about this. Many people didn't even know that the money in the system was theirs. They thought it belonged to the pension plans. So this is statistics from 2016-17. But even now, it's not much better. So we had an election, we have a conservative government now. 87% know the movement, No More AFP. And 80% of the ones that know the movement support it. agree with that. So there is a huge political push against the private pension industry, basically, due to the low contributions. And so let's go to what lessons do we learn? Well, I have two parts. Lesson learned, the more important part, I think, is political. So there was no independent institution to act in the best interest of the members and explain the system, right? The people don't know what the system does. They don't know that they have to contribute more. There's no knowledge about the system at all. That's in my view, that's the main lessons to be learned. And then there's of course other technical lessons that you have to have more incentives and all of this. But you can read this yourself. But it's more, it's the political is the main thing, the main lessons in my view, that you have to have someone that explains the system, that is independent, that speaks out for the workers, and that has not happened. And the Chile's next step, lots of technical things to reduce all of this, but there's also some things, it's very political now. They're talking about, introducing a state-owned pension administrator. They are talking about increasing the competition, but you already have 6 companies. It's super competitive. They're talking about raising the contribution rates. That makes a lot of sense. 4% more, and they could give it to the private pension companies. They would administer it free. But some people say no more money to the AFPs, so there are some politicians that prefer creating another institution financed by tax money. So it's super political, and that's, again, a main lesson. The discussion is not technical, very political. So that was it about the Chile system.
Unfortunately. Let's see if in the US we can have some more, let's say, cheerful ideas.
Positive?
Yeah.
Some positive news. Well, we like to refer to the situation in Chile as the era of personal responsibility, which we've already experienced in the US. But as Eduardo indicated, my role is in federal government relations. So I work with members of Congress on retirement security policy, and as you can all see from my physical experience, it's a dangerous job. I don't know if it's the same in Brazil, but it is certainly in Washington, D.C. The one thing that I think all of us can agree upon is that human beings, their very nature, are really terrible at taking action on their own, preparing for their future financial security. So whether it's emergency savings or it's retirement savings, we experience challenges. And the challenges are, partially due to consumerism, partially due to inertia, complacency. Case in point, new iPhones are available, $1,000 US. And when it was announced, my college-age son begged for his mother and I to upgrade him immediately. That's not happening, but it's an indication of the kind of the thought process of the typical working American. I'm not immune to it. I subscribed to HBO recently solely to see the last season of Game of Thrones. Anyone else? Game of Thrones? Okay, exactly. But there is good news, and the good news is that after 40 years of studying the voluntary contributory system in the United States, we're starting to learn something about how people behave, and specifically the behavioral tendencies that limit individual savings. But before I go into that, I'll provide a brief kind of summary of the holistic American retirement system, and we'll start with kind of the foundational pillar, which is our mandatory pay-as-you-go government-run pension scheme that we refer to as Social Security. So Social Security is funded by payroll deductions of 12.5%, roughly half from the employer, half from the worker. The system was never designed to be the primary income source for working Americans in retirement. Rather, it was designed as a highly progressive system. So if you're in the lowest income quintile, you'll expect to receive 90% plus income replacement after taxes. That rate gradually declines until you get to the highest income quintile, where that replacement rate is more like 30%. So as you can see from that, supplementary savings were always intended to be an important part of the retirement security picture for Americans. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we in the United States also have a fiscal challenge facing our Social Security system. So as it stands right now, we expect our surplus fund to be essentially tapped out somewhere around the year 2034. And if that happens, and Congress doesn't step in and solve some of the issues related to it, we can expect that Social Security payments will be cut by approximately 21%. So we're not completely defunct at that time, but certainly it becomes a much more dire situation for us for the longevity of the program. So moving on, and most of my comments will be focused on the voluntary system. Our second kind of fundamental pillar of retirement security is our voluntary contributory system in the United States. The foundation of that is employer-sponsored retirement plans. So worksite retirement plans where either there's a pension, a traditional type pension, which those are becoming more and more rare in the United States, and being replaced by specific contributory defined contribution type plans. We also have individual retirement accounts in the U.S. And the important thing to remember here, and the kind of the lesson from the U.S., is that while there are about equal assets in defined contribution plans as there are in individual retirement accounts, the vast majority, 90% plus of the assets in IRAs actually generated in the employer-sponsored retirement system. So it shows you how important that employer-worksite relationship is in actually getting people to save for retirement. And in fact, I want to illustrate that a little bit more. When you look at working Americans, only 1 in 10 actively contribute to an individual retirement account. But when they have access to a worksite employer-sponsored plan, 70% on average will participate in that plan. So it's a huge motivator. There are other benefits as well. And I should mention that the most common type of defined contribution plan today in the U.S. is the 401k retirement plan. So 401k simply refers to the IRS tax code where it's defined. So we're not very imaginative in the U.S. We point to the code and we call it 401k. But with 401ks, again, they're contributory, they're voluntary, both for the employer. So the employer has the option to sponsor a plan or not sponsor a plan. And employees with access have the option of contributing or not contributing. And that's partially the challenge, and I'll get to that in the future. But there are also tax advantages with the system. So for workers, all contributions and the earnings that they generate on those contributions are tax deferred, meaning they pay no income taxes until such time as they withdraw those assets from the system. And hopefully that's retirement and not some point earlier than that. Employers also have tax incentives. They receive deductions on the contributions that they make on behalf of employees. So there's an incentive for employers to actually provide additional contributions on behalf of their employees. Importantly, this is an open market system. So as opposed to Chile, where there is a limited number of providers, there are no limitations in the US. So it's an open market. There really aren't controls on who can be a provider. And the really interesting dynamic that's occurred over the last decade to 2 decades is that 2 decades ago, I would have characterized the providers in the industry as being what I would call fully bundled providers. And these are providers that offer the record-keeping services, administrative support, potentially support for education, a call center for participants or employees in the plan, and investment management. So it was very common to have that provider have their own set of investment options that they managed and provided to their clients. Today it's much different. So what we see today is primarily what I would call partially bundled. So a company like Principal provides all of those requisite services needed to sponsor a 401k plan for an employer. But our investment fund family, which we have one, is only one family in a menu of hundreds that we make available to our clients. So they have a menu of thousands of mutual funds and other investment vehicles that they can choose from. So for an employer, that's partially the challenge. I mean, it's a benefit, you have significant choice, but it's a challenge because employers in this system have significant fiduciary obligations. So they are responsible for ensuring that the investments that they select for their workers are prudent investment options, both when they initially select and in an ongoing basis. So there's liability associated with that. There's certain responsibilities in terms of monitoring and making fund changes in the future. So there's a large industry in the U.S. Around financial advice provided to plan sponsors, employers, where financial professionals actually provide advice to those employers to help with those fiduciary responsibilities. So let's talk about the successes of the U.S. voluntary system. So today, I mean, one of the things that you can directly point to, over $26 trillion of assets invested and accumulated in the voluntary system today. About 17 trillion of that in 401k plans and IRAs. In terms of coverage, the more traditional full-time worker with a certain income level has very good coverage. So more than 70% of those have access to a worksite retirement plan, and when they do, as I mentioned, 70% tend to participate. The private system also gives some advantages to employers in that they can customize their plan to their specific workforce. So there's significant flexibility in terms of plan design, in terms of the amount of contributions that the employer makes on behalf of the employee, as well as the ability to differentiate that employer and their benefit package from competitors that they're directly competing with. So, we always like to say that the 401k plan is one of the key tools to help an employer attract and retain key talent. So they're competing with those other companies, and if their match percentage that they're providing to that employee in the 401k plan is higher than their competitor, it gives them an edge. So, talk about advantages and successes, but we also have challenges. So I would characterize the challenges in three categories. So the first is coverage of worksite retirement savings plans for American workers. So it's estimated today that about 30% of the American workforce does not have access to a worksite savings plan. And remember, I mentioned that when a worker is faced on making those decisions on their own, we only see about 1 in 10 actually contribute to an individual product. So it's very important that they have access to that worksite savings employer relationship. And specifically, there are types of U.S. workers that are more disadvantaged in terms of access. Specifically, employees of small businesses. It's much more likely that a small business does not sponsor a worksite retirement savings plan as a large employer in the U.S. So there's a lot of attention focused on workers of small businesses and how we can improve that picture. Part-time workers, employers are legally able to exclude part-time workers from their retirement savings plan. And so there's some thought around how we can actually incorporate those individuals, but not have some of the negative side effects that actually would occur within a plan structure and to the employer by having part-time employees that may be just kind of short-term employees who move from job to job. And then the third category of workers are what I would characterize as gig economy workers. So I think everyone is experiencing this challenge. These are non-traditional workers independent contractors who don't have an employer-employee relationship. And under US law, the employer can't provide a benefit to those individuals without actually undertaking an employer relationship with them. So there's a lot of focus on how we can actually help facilitate employers who might have a large contingent of independent contract workers actually provide contributions. And a lot of employers who are in that situation want to provide some type of benefit in the same way that they do for their employees. The second key challenge for us is improving retirement savings adequacy. So getting people to save more when they have access to a 401k plan or other plan. The Employee Benefit Research Institute, which is a great nonpartisan research organization in Washington, D.C., published a report this year, and they found that about 41% of U.S. households where the head of the household is between ages 35 and 64 are projected to run short of money in retirement. So we need to improve that picture. The good news is that we have learned so much from analyzing the 401k system and behaviors of individuals that we know how we can design a plan to actually drive those levels, both of participation in the plan as well as their contribution levels much higher. And so let me just kind of go through a few of those because I think it's very important to kind of see how the U.S. system is gravitating towards what I would call best practice plan design. So the first is automatic enrollment. Giving basically a nudge, a helpful nudge to your workers to get them to contribute, giving them the option to opt out if they feel like they're financially incapable of doing that. And when you do that nudge, the important thing for everyone to understand is that a worker who is automatically enrolled at, say, 1% of pay somehow believes that's a recommendation and they stay there. So 1% of pay is not sufficient to actually accumulate for retirement security. And over many years, there was a kind of a governmental safe harbor where it was mentioned that 3% of pay auto-enrollment was appropriate. And so we have thousands of plans that have that default rate set at 3%. We need to get that higher. We need to have it set at 6% or higher. And typically, we'd like to see an employer contribution along with that. The really good news there is that 80% of employers today provide an employer contribution. The average is about 3% of pay. So if you have your employees saving 6% right from the start, they get 3% employer contribution, they're at 9% savings. So what happens from there? Well, the next kind of key step is something we call auto-escalation. And so this is essentially another automatic mechanism where the year following enrollment, that individual is automatically escalated from their 6% contribution rate to a 7% contribution rate. The fascinating thing that we see here is that when individuals are subjected to this in an opt-out manner, they go along with it. They don't opt out in high numbers. And in fact, when we studied automatic enrollment at 3% compared to automatic enrollment at 6%, there was no discernible difference in opt-out rate. Only 11% of workers opted out in either case. So it shows that there's capacity to push those contributions higher. The other kind of key learning is the investment structure. And so in the US, years ago, thankfully, there was legislation and law that actually established qualified default investment options. And the most important one there is the target date category. And so what we see today is that individuals who are opted into their plan, automatically enrolled into their plan, and make no decision on investment management are largely defaulted into an appropriate target date investment option for their age relative to their expected retirement date. And so that's kind of avoided the situation of having workers enrolled heavily in maybe fixed income or low earning types of investments when they're younger, but also appropriately taking into account their age at whatever point they're automatically enrolled into the plan. So the third kind of challenge here is lifetime income. So given the fact that defined contribution plans are the predominant savings in the U.S., and they've come to be the predominant actual contingent of an employee's overall retirement income, it's important, and something we've learned is that individuals who have a nest egg of dollars that they've accumulated in their 401k plan suddenly need a lot of assistance as they approach retirement in determining how they can draw down those assets and make them last for the rest of their life. And so, unfortunately, in the U.S., the average American worker has a very dim view of annuities. And obviously, annuities are the only product in the U.S. that can provide guaranteed income for a lifetime. Annuities have not been widely adopted in 401k plans as a pay-down option because of some liabilities that exist in the U.S. law. So lawmakers are looking intently at solving that picture to make it easier for employers to make available a lifetime income option. And it could be a range of things, and this is one of the kind of fascinating points of the U.S. system. Because of the competitive open market, you have significant innovation going on, not only in this particular category, all types of issues, but particularly here, you see just fascinating product solutions that combine different types of methodologies for pay down, whether it be just an advice-based pay down method combined with some type of annuity. It may be a deeply deferred annuity that gives that individual comfort that at the age of 80, they'll have an income stream that will kick in and keep them from dropping into poverty. Or it could be an income stream that starts right at retirement and continues through their lifetime. So again, here we're really focused on helping the average American worker understand retirement income considerations. It starts with education, and you see a lot of companies that provide 401k plans actually give the participants in these plans not only a statement that shows their dollar amount that they've saved, but they translate that to an income illustration. So what is your nest egg going to convert to in terms of monthly guaranteed income? And what this does is it helps that person put that gigantic dollar amount, that the largest that they've ever saved, into a really realistic monthly income amount that helps them then decide, do I need to increase my contribution rate? Do I need to change my investment allocation? To give them that kind of help to make some decisions. And then obviously products come next. So that's really kind of what we're faced with today. We do have legislative activity around Social Security and helping to improve that picture, but I'll defer that to anyone that might have questions in the Q&A session. So I'll pass it.
Maree, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think it's clear to say that whilst we're a big world, it sounds like the challenges that are present both in the US and in Chile are challenges we also have in the Australian market. So this afternoon I wanted to focus on 4 key areas: why superannuation and what the purpose of superannuation is. I don't know why we call it superannuation. I think down under we thought we were going to be a little bit special, and so we gave it a new term, superannuation.
Sounds better than 401k.
Sounds better, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm an accountant, so I know what legislation and standards is very exciting, Lance, but we've gone a bit more exciting and chosen superannuation. The history of superannuation, and certainly where the industry is at today, and where the industry needs to go given the challenges that we have as an industry as well. So I might start off by just talking about where does superannuation actually sit within our retirement income space. Now in Australia, over the last 2 decades, we think about retirement income in 3 different pillars. Because we look at when individuals retire, there are 3 different areas whereby they will get their retirement income. The first one is their private savings, and in Australia it is usually their home. In Australia we still have what we refer to as the Great Australian Dream, and that is owning your own home. And so the home is usually the one thing that Australians do have when they retire. The challenge we have in Australia is that a lot of retirees don't like to actually leave their home. So some are very asset rich, but they're cash flow poor, so they don't have that income stream that they can actually draw upon. The second one there is the age pension, and that's the government pension that is provided. Currently that number is the biggest number within the Australian budget. So that is the biggest number that the Australian government has to consider every year when they are setting the budget. And that government pension was actually designed just to give a basic lifestyle within retirement for individuals that don't actually have sufficient funds to retire. And that's where superannuation came in. Superannuation was designed to supplement that Australian government pension that was provided. So it wasn't designed to replace the government pension, it was actually designed to supplement the government pension that the government was willing to provide. So what does superannuation actually include? So superannuation is actually a compulsory system in Australia. And what that means is that the employer actually provides the contributions into a superannuation fund. And I'll talk a little bit later about the number of superannuation funds that we have and the types of superannuations, many more than what you have in Chile, so you'll be very surprised. So basically what that means is that currently the employer contributes 9% of an individual's salary. That is to be increased by 2025. That number will go up to 15% unless our government changes and decides that that number will be changed or will be stopped. But when you actually see a little bit later on when I talk about the figures, 15% is still not enough. So we definitely do need to increase those contributions. There is voluntary contributions, and the voluntary are made by the individual. However, that 9% by the employer is compulsory. So everyone who has an employer relationship will have 9% go into a superannuation fund. If you are an individual who does not have an employer relationship, it is not compulsory, but I'll talk a little bit later on how that actually works in the Australian market, although it does not alleviate the problems with gig economy, contractors, etc. So we still do have those same problems as well. The incentive to contribute is a differentiation from a tax perspective. So the employer also does get a tax deduction if they make those, when they make those contributions. And for any other contributions going into a superannuation fund, they are only taxed at 15%. So the earnings on the investment earnings on the contributions are also taxed at 15%. What that means is that you are able to contribute more than what the employer contributes, but there is a cap, and that cap is $25,000 Australian dollars. And if you contribute more than that, you actually will be taxed at your personal tax rate. The lowest personal tax rate in Australia is 19%, the highest is 45%. So if you contribute $25,001, your $1 will be taxed at your personal tax rate. So there is you need to maintain that buffer. Within our superannuation, we also do have insurance for death, disability, whether it's permanent or temporary. So we also do have that availability in our insurance, in our superannuation, and the premiums for that insurance get paid out of your superannuation fund. So you do not need to make additional contributions for that. It will come out of your superannuation fund. And getting access to it, of course, it is there for retirement. So you are only able to get that access as at retirement age. I'll talk about retirement age later on. But you are able to early retire. We have products which are referred to as transition to retirement, which means you can get early access to it, but you need to prove that you have retired to be able to get access to these superannuation monies. So where did our superannuation system start? So Australia, as you well know, is a very young country. So we were only founded in 1788 and federation happened in 1901. So a very young country. And so our government pension started in 1909. So from 1909 to 1985, we only had the government pension. After that was when the compulsory superannuation system started to develop. In 1985, what we had was a very large trade union in Australia and the government who came together to determine that instead of increasing or continuing to increase wages, what we would do was we would start to help Australians save for their retirement, because we had the same situation where Australians were not saving any money. And so that trade union and the government got together and determined that that certain amount of money would be put aside for individuals' retirement. And we actually started at 9%. In 1992, that's when it became compulsory for everyone. So in 1985, it was only certain industries that had superannuation. In 1992 was when it actually became compulsory for everyone. And as I said, in 2019, we're currently at 9.5%, and that will increase to 15%, hopefully, if it doesn't change. So for a very young industry, our current industry is about worth 2.4 trillion Australian dollars. Now we have a very small population in comparison to Brazil. Australia is a population of $24 million. So currently that $2.4 trillion is around 120% GDP. In about 10 to 15 years' time, it will be about 200% GDP. So it will grow very, very quickly. It's taken from 1992 to 2019 to get to 2.4 trillion. In 2035, we estimate to be about $9.5 trillion if the trajectory of the contributions increases as we've projected it to. I spoke earlier about the number of different superannuation funds we have. Currently we have around 195, not 6, superannuation funds, and that is actually split into a number of different areas. We have retail funds. Retail funds are funds that are owned by banks or insurers. So our largest banks, for example, National Australia Bank, will have a superannuation fund that you are able to contribute into. We have industry funds. These are funds that actually belong to an industry. So for example, our building industry has its own industry fund and it's called CBUS. So we have individual industries that actually do have their own superannuation funds. We then have corporate funds. These corporate funds are actually decreasing, and they're decreasing because the regulation in the superannuation industry is becoming more and more difficult. Corporate funds are funds that are actually owned by large employers. So as you know, our largest airline, Qantas, they still have their own corporate fund. So they have the corporate superannuation fund. There are very limited numbers of corporate superannuation funds at the moment, and it's only the very, very large employers that have those. I'll skip over the self-managed super funds and I'll come back to that in a minute. We then have the public sector funds. These are the ones that are government funds. So these are the ones that have been established for a very long time, where you have government employees that get the contributions. These actually tend to be higher than the 9.5%. The government, for some individuals, has determined that these individuals will get higher contributions. Our university schemes, for example, some individuals get up to 15% contributions already, so these are quite different. And then we have what I referred to as the self-managed superannuation funds. And these are the ones where individuals who are self-employed tend to have their own superannuation fund. They're like private funds. The difference with the self-managed superannuation fund is you are only allowed to have 5 members or less. And so that means that it's predominantly families who set up their own self-managed superannuation funds, who have their own businesses. Some of them have their own business properties within their self-managed superannuation funds. So they use them not only for retirement savings, but they actually use them for other purposes which they weren't technically set up to be used for. So where are we today, and what does it actually mean from a retirement perspective? We have an industry association which is the Australian Superannuation Fund Association, and they did they did some research into retirement on how much retirement income individuals actually need. So how much money do people need to retire? Now, in Australia, currently the life expectancy for women is 89 years of age. So I'm pleased to say that hopefully I'm going to live to 89 at this stage, although I haven't quite figured out if I want to live longer or die earlier when I actually look at the statistics. Women is 89, and men is currently 86. By 2050, men will be 91 and women will be 93. Our retirement age currently for individuals born before 1952 is 65. As the years progress, our retirement age will be 65. Now, why is that important? If you look at the age of women's life expectancy, and if you look at retirement age, some women might actually be in retirement longer than they've actually been in the workforce. So, as we indicated earlier, women, some stay home to be mothers. Even when they join the workforce or rejoin the workforce, some will actually leave the workforce to look after elderly parents, for example. And so they're out of the workforce longer than men are. And so for some women, they will be out of the in retirement longer than they're actually going to be in the workforce. Now, the research that ASFA did suggested that for individuals to retire on a comfortable lifestyle, and I'll explain what that means later, is they will need $437,000 per annum to retire. Now, if we actually look at a woman who retires at 65 and who does reach the age of 89, if we look at her average account balance and what she retires on at the moment and what she would get from just the age pension, she would only get $612,000 at retirement. To lead a comfortable lead a modest lifestyle, she will need $663,000. To lead a comfortable lifestyle, ASFA has estimated that she would actually need $1 million when she retires. Now, this is Australian dollars, to see her through to the 89 years of age. I think the other thing to note is that is a young retiree. What hasn't been factored in is as you get older, you actually need more money for medical expenses. The assumption is that you're actually going to spend money in other areas like travel, for example, and you'll actually spend that money on medical expenses. So that's why they've based those numbers. Now, if we focus on the difference between what the age pension actually provides you and what the comfortable lifestyle provides you, is if you look at the age pension, you do not have the ability to actually do any repairs on your home whatsoever. And whereas with a comfortable lifestyle, you would have the ability to replace your bathroom or replace your kitchen. With the age pension, you have basic clothes. You cannot have nice clothes. With the age pension, you would own a car, but you wouldn't even be able to afford any repairs on your car. Whereas with a comfortable, you would actually be able to have a nice car. So it really depends on the standard of life that you're living. But at the moment, regardless of whether you look for the age pension or whether you're seeking for a comfortable retirement, the retirement savings that you have outside of superannuation and the retirement savings that you're actually achieving with superannuation as it stands today is not enough for an individual to retire given our life expectancy. Hence why we need our contribution rate to go up to 15%. So I'm going to end it on what we need to do, and we also have a number of the challenges that have the other countries face. I think the challenge for Australia is because we are a compulsory system, our individuals, our employees have become lazy. And what that means is they're not engaged with their superannuation. They leave it up to the employer to actually put the money into a superannuation fund. Financial literacy is a big challenge in Australia, and we need to ensure that each individual is educated sufficiently to ensure that the employer and where their employer is actually putting in the money is in the best interest for them. The difference in Australia is the burden of that member's best interest is not on the employer. The burden of the member's best interest is actually on the superannuation fund. The structure of a superannuation fund is a trustee, and so the board of that superannuation fund is a trustee for all the members. And so the burden is on them to make sure that they are actually making the right decision for the members. And so what that actually means is that our trustees and our superannuation funds are saying this is actually becoming all too difficult, and the number of superannuation funds we're actually seeing are starting to consolidate. So that 195 used to be 600 funds. We used to have that many more funds, but the market is actually consolidating. So we need to engage with our members. And we also need to design retirement products. We've done a fantastic job in the accumulation phase where we've been able to start to build the savings. But now that we actually have a number of individuals who are starting to retire, we need to determine what those products look like. And like Chile and like the US, annuity products have not been a part of the Australian retirement system. And so building those retirement products is something that, as an Australian market, we need to get better at. So I'm happy to stop there and take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Seems that all the systems need to be compulsory, at least to start. But talking to the other side, have you seen in your countries a voluntary push, let's say, education or something that will move people to invest for their retirement?
In Chile, definitely not. And there's some of the one slide that I showed is, well, in Chile the problem is there's a large segment of poor people that cannot afford this. But even the ones who can do not save enough voluntarily. There's been very little education about the need to save. And because I think people were very comfortable, right? The government created this system in the 80s, and the public or the private administrators, like the company that I worked for, they managed it, but no one actually educated the public about the need to, well, retire later, increase contributions, save more. No, in Chile, definitely not. It's a big problem.
Well, in the U.S., as I've described, we've been working in this voluntary kind of environment for many, many years. And, to some extent, I think we've done relatively well at getting workers enrolled into plans. And a lot of that is based on the employer's commitment to educate their workers about the benefit. It's common for an employer to hold what we call enrollment meetings. So they have new workers that come in, they become eligible, and they're educated on the benefit and encouraged to participate in the plan. As a service provider, that's been a core part of our service package for employers, is actually providing resources to do those types of meetings. And when we have that type of engagement, we have really good participation rates, but they don't equal the participation rates of automatic enrollment. So that best practice plan design is far and above better than anything else that is offered in the market today. So I see studies all the time that show that employers who have incorporated automatic enrollment drive their participation rates up from levels in the 50 to 60% of their workers up to 90% plus actually contributing in their plan. So I think for us and for the U.S. Congress, there's a realization that there is a fix. There is a kind of formula that works here, and it's our job to encourage that to be used more widely. That could come in the form of a requirement under federal law. That is something that we're looking at. There's a bill today in the U.S. Congress that's envisioning that. I would say one more thing about a development in the U.S. market. Some state governments have taken their own initiative and established mandates on employers with workers within the jurisdiction of the given state, where they require that employer to provide a worksite savings plan for their employees. And the state government is actually getting involved as a provider. So this is a new dynamic that we're starting to see in the U.S., and there is some concern. There is concern that you could have a patchwork of rules, and if you're a multi-state employer, you're going to have to be conscious of that patchwork of rules wherever you have workers. So there's definitely some interest in having a consistent federal law if that's the way things are going in the United States.
The Ask for Retirement Standard is the beginning of helping individuals understand that they need more money to retire. The challenge we have is that it's only the people who are close to retirement that are actually understanding that. My strong view is that financial education needs to start within schools. Children and students need to learn about their financial well-being a lot earlier for this to actually help through to retirement.
I really thought they were doing this in Chile.
Well, in Chile, in the last 3 years, it has changed a little bit because, of course, the public has attacked the fund administrators so much that now, you can download, you have an app, the pension companies actually, some of them have an app, you can go in it, you see what your pension will be, you see how much more you need to save to have an adequate pension, but the people that have that app and download the app, they're already interested, they are already generally more literate. So I agree with, in school, this needs to be something that that kids need to be educated, that very young people need to be educated about.
We've
not talk about millennials.
Oh yeah. I mean, in Australia, we've just been through a royal commission into the financial services industry, and that was looking at a lot of complaints that were coming out of all of financial services. So it wasn't just superannuation; it was banks and it was insurers. And it was unfortunate to see that a lot of the issues that came through the Royal Commission, if individuals were financially literate, a lot of the things that they'd gotten themselves into, they wouldn't have gotten themselves into. So that financial education really does need to start a lot younger. There are a lot of bright people who are not financially literate. And so we really need to make that part of learning of children from day one.
I would just mention that our experience in having rolled out over the last year a digital experience that incorporates app, it incorporates an engaging type of interface with the individual. When we compare that population who's went through that experience with a similar population who has went through a traditional paper-based enrollment process, we see contribution rates that are 30% higher in the group that's been through the engaging digital experience. So I do think that there's a lot of learning to take place around how people really react to different types of engagement. And really, I think there are super benefits around the digital kind of development that's taking place, certainly in the U.S. and other places.
Going down to business, let's say, who are the players in this market? I think AFPs are only private.
Yes, they're only private companies.
And how much is the fee? You didn't mention.
The fee is actually fairly low. There are statistics in my presentation. It's roughly 70 basis points of AUM. They calculate it differently in Chile. You pay it once, and then the money has to be administrated for life by these companies. But if you convert it to an AUM fee as 70 basis points, which is actually fairly low compared to international standards. It's not high.
Is there a distribution scheme? People who sells the fund itself?
Yes. So each pension company has a large distribution network of salespeople, basically.
And they have to remunerate themselves from 0.7.
Yes, exactly. So that's definitely, and you could argue that's an inefficiency in the system, but there are private companies, and it comes all out of that 70 basis points. But it's low. It's a low fee compared to others. There's a statistics in there. It's among the lowest fees.
I see. In the U.S., I think it's free. I mean,
yes,
it's a market.
It's a free market. Yes, I thought you meant free for plans.
No, they're becoming free, right?
Yes, right. Yes, it's a open market, and importantly in the U.S., the competitive marketplace has been fierce, and so fees have decreased consistently. Margins have decreased as well, and so we are starting to see, have been seeing, and will continue to see consolidation amongst retirement plan providers. And so typically, this is the record-keeping administrative kind of portion of the service delivery. And, I mentioned earlier that the marketplace has evolved to be more of a partially bundled or even unbundled, where you have investment management completely separated from the record-keeping administrative elements. And, that creates pressures on those that are really solely in the record-keeping administrative space, because that's where the margins are smallest. If you can incorporate an element of investment management, you can improve that picture. And so, players like Principal and others that are looking to remain major players have to continue to build scale. So those economies are going to be important for us to drive down costs, but also investment management is an important piece of it as well. So, it would be interesting to see how things play out over the next decade or so for our marketplace.
How about Australia? There's 120 funds.
I could spend a day explaining how what the different structures are in Australia. We have the bundled, we have the unbundled, we have the outsourced, we have the insourced. But because of all the different permutations and combinations, we are actually an expensive industry. Fees are actually quite high, and that's one area where we actually need to to be better. Whilst we're a compulsory industry and we've done great to accumulate, we're actually an expensive industry, and that's where entities at the moment are trying to manage their costs.
So I have some questions from the audience. Very difficult to manage this. To Chile. The small number of pension funds administration in Chile is a problem. Is that too much concentration?
No, it's not a problem. It was actually higher when it started out. It was 15, 16, then it went up to almost 20, and the fees were a lot higher. So you need consolidation to bring the fees down and to make it more attractive. I think the competition is very fierce. You have 6 pension funds. It's not that the market is closed; the market's open. There's actually another fund is actually going to start this year, and if you have the capital and follow the regulation, you can open it. It's the product of market pressure is that it went down to 6, and. So I think it's actually a good size in my view. Why would you need hundreds? It's more inefficient.
What would be the average portfolio of the Australian superannuation? Is there any active investing overseas? Is it correct to consider Australia's sovereign wealth funds?
So Australia only has one sovereign wealth fund, which is the Future Fund. And they're about, at the moment, they're about 180 billion Australian dollars. Our largest superannuation fund is Australian Super, and they're about $160 billion. So currently we have a challenge in Australia. Because of the constant cash flow that we have, we don't have enough investment opportunities in Australia, and so we do look to invest offshore. We can't actually even invest our money fast enough. And because we're so far away from everyone, it is actually trying to have a presence in a market to be able to find those new investments. So the largest superannuation fund, Australian Super, they've actually set up an office in the UK, they've set up an office in China, and they're about to set up an office in New York as well. So they're actually present in a market to be able to do more of that offshoring investment. They do it already, but they do it through other entities. This is about them actually being in the market and doing it themselves.
Okay. This one is for Lance. In your opinion, what is the main reason U.S. workers have not been opting for the annuities plan?
That's a fascinating question, and one that we struggle with every day. I think some of it is rooted in kind of the average American psyche that does not want to essentially give their liquid assets to some entity and give up control going into the future. So I think that's really the root of it. But if you sat that same individual down and said, your father, for example, had a pension fund from their employer, how do you view that pension fund and that experience? They would, in vast majority, say, I wish I had that arrangement. Yet with a pension fund, you have no access to the liquid assets. It is a guaranteed payment over a number of years, which is exactly what an annuity provides. So, I think a lot of our focus, our challenge, is educating American workers on the benefits of annuities. And for another kind of angle, the safeguards around the American life insurance industry in terms of the reserves that must be held back by each company, by the kind of safety systems in the event of a failure, which failures have been very, very infrequent in the U.S. system. So, in part, when you compare an annuity from an American life insurance company to existing defined benefit plans offered by private sector employers, you're probably in a better situation with having an annuity from an American life insurance company because of the danger of the defined benefit from your employer being frozen at some point in the future. So, yes, it's a great challenge, and one that, again, starts with education, I think, early in school, but also is a real challenge for us with near retirees today.
That and the compulsory nature of our industry is why it works well. And I'll give you an example. I had two tradesmen at my house. They had to do some work, and I asked them if they had superannuation, and they said they did. And I said, who was it with? And they said CBUS, which was the building industry superannuation. And I asked them, if you weren't forced to save that money, would you save that money? And they said no. And they said, thank God we have superannuation. And these were young men. They said we would just spend it at the bar on a Friday night. We would not, and they were honest. So they said, we know that having superannuation will give us something. So whilst they're not engaged, they know that they'll have something at the end of the day. So that's why the compulsory nature of our system has worked in some ways.
Okay, good. I will not ask how to start a program because that should be very difficult. We only have 2 minutes, so for your final remarks, if you want to say anything that could help us at least start the movement.
Well, I think for Brazilians, of course, you know, a good lesson would be learn from Chile and try to have a system that has, if you go to this capitalization system, that there's actually a voice of the people, of the participants in the system, so that in a few years you don't run into the same problems, right? That some politicians will attack the system and will go back to the old pay-as-you-go system. I think that would be, and that the system is adequate for the labor market. I mean, you also have a large informal labor market, and these people need to be covered somehow. You can't design a system that only covers a few people.
That'll be the same in Brazil. We have a lot of informal.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Those would be the lessons. Yeah.
Right. I would totally agree with that. You know, as a country who has a mandatory pay-as-you-go system that faces significant fiscal challenges in the future, when you look at the retirement picture of American workers now and looking at those who will retire over the next decades, you know, it is super important for us as a country and for Brazil as well to try to solve those problems with that mandatory system to provide that foundational framework that you can then build supplementary savings onto. And, you know, the key, what you've heard from us is the key, I think, in supplementary savings is that engagement and the buy-in from the worker themselves. You know, it is easy, if it's not within the control of the worker, to get lazy and to kind of expect that someone's taking care of this whole formula for them, and that's not the case. So, you know, to the extent that education, specific beneficial nudges, as we call them, that they can be applied, they work. And we've seen that in the behavioral studies in the U.S.
Agree completely. Education is key. But educate based on the generations that you're actually trying to talk to. The millennials will expect something different to those that are close to retirement. So how do you educate each of those different types of generations to get the value that they need and the value that your country needs?
So thank you very, very much. We learned a lot. And probably we'll be get in touch with you to get some more ideas. Obrigado a todos.
Obrigado.
Obrigado.